Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So we are going to continue the discussions in Chapter 7 to talk about GDP and also moving on to the new topic of price level. So we are going to start with the measure of real GDP and nominal GDP in this videos, and then we'll move on to the topic of the measurements of price level next. So remember in the previous discussions, we have talked about the measure of GDP and how it tracks the overall economic activities and also how we are breaking it down into the two theoretical approach to measure the GDP, the income approach and also the expenditure approach. So now we would like to shift the topic a little bit to how we are going to compare the GDP across time, right? So since the GDP measure is the measure of the market values of goods and services over time, so there is a components there. So unlike we are talking about previous year we make 10 cars, but this year we're making 12 cars because the price of the cars also changes. So therefore, we have to consider when there is a changes of price level over time and how it affects the measure of GDP or the market values of the overall goods and services in general. Well, to do that, we are first going to think about the growth of the economy can be measured if we fix the price um, in the economy, right? So if prices never change, then the measure of this GDP across time will be easy. However, because there are some price level changes, right? So inflation or sometimes deflation could happen. So we have to take that into considerations. And we're basically coming up with the new measurements here, or maybe a measurements that we mentioned last time called real GDP. So the real GDP is the measurements of GDP that actually account for inflation and deflation so that we can compare the GDP figures in different time periods. Unlike the nominal GDP, right? So the nominal GDP only refers to the market values using the price at the time of the measurements. So therefore, the measure of nominal GDP cannot be compared across time. So only real GDP can be compared across time. So given that, well, we are going to think about how we are measuring what we call real GDP. And the simple concept here is to say, well, what if we have this price level fixed across time periods? And to make that happen, we have to first consider, okay, maybe there is a year that we want to set the price level for our measurements, and then we just keep that price level across time periods so that we can actually fix the price across different time periods and without worrying about the prices are changing from one to another. So we call this a base year, right? So in order to measure the real GDP, we have to actually set a base year for the price that we are going to use to calculate the market values of goods and services. So the confusions here is usually student will ask, so when is that base year and how are we going to set that base year? To be honest, there is no, so at this very beginning level of class, you don't have to worry about like when and how we're going to set the base year. So the more important concept here is if you are seeing some real GDP measures and they are basically saying that, well, we are using the 2000 price level, or maybe we have this real GDP measured by the current price level. So you know, that means, well, that's the year that the official agencies actually used to calculate the real GDP compare across different time periods. Right? It doesn't really matter which base year you're setting, right? All right, so let's give an example real quick. So let's suppose we have this example of three products in an economy between, well, not between, but uh, the 2 years of productions to compare. So 2010 and 2015. So we produce certain amounts of tuner, carrot juice, and X-ray examinations. And each of these has a price specific to that particular time years. Well, to measure the nominal GDP in 2015, it's fairly easy, right? Or even 2010. We're basically using that current price and the current quantity and to measure the total market values of a particular product. And then we sum the total values together, right, in this particular economy. So the nominal GDP in 2015 in this case is 1,575. Well, comparing the real GDP, the nominal GDP in 2010, we can definitely say that, well, we have a higher level of GDP in 2015 to 2010. But is it necessarily true that we are basically doing a lot better than 2010, right? So if you do a quick math here, the total values in 2012 or 2010 should be 20 times 5, right, which is $100, and 50 times 2, another $200, and then, $100, and then 10 times 80, which is $800, so it adds up to $1,000. So that means, well, if we compare the nominal GDP in 2010 and 2015, we are $575 better, right, than 2010 comparing to our current time period, 2015. But is it really necessarily true, right? Well, as we mentioned, well, nominal GDP cannot be compared across time because prices change. So to take that into considerations, we're going to do this math a slightly different. So to calculate the real GDP, we're going to set a base year here to say, well, let's use the base year in 2010. So once we set the base year, we're going to use the prices in 2010 because that is our base year. And we're using that base year price or prices to multiply the quantity we produce in 2015. So in this case, we're calculating the tuner values to be 30 times 5, and the total value of carrot juice 55 times 2, and so on. So the real GDP in 2015, using the base year price 2010, we get the values of 1,220. So in this measurement, we get a lot smaller values here. But this value can be directly compared to the GDP in 2010. And the reason is because in both year measurements, we're using the exact same set of prices. So price doesn't change, but the only thing changed in the calculation here is the quantity of the outputs. And as a result, we know in 2015, we are actually doing better, but not by 500 something dollar, but it's only better by $220 comparing to the level of prices in 2010, where 2010 we only produce or enjoying $1,000 worth of goods and services. But in 2015, using the same price in 2010, we are enjoying $1,200 and $220 values of goods and services in the 15. So given this simple example, hopefully it makes sense now for you guys to consider using the real GDP compare the total economic activities across time. So after the simple examples, to demonstrate the use of the real GDP, we also notice in this graph right here, the real GDP and the nominal GDP has this very interesting characteristic as well. So you can see this plot right here. It's plotting the real GDP and the nominal GDP in the UK across time periods. The red one is the real GDP, and the blue one is the nominal GDP. And the base year that measures the real GDP is in 2009. And you can see this The red line, the real GDP, is consistently higher compared to the nominal GDP, the blue lines, before 2009. And then after that, there is a crossing point where the blue lines will always be greater than the red line after 2009. So what does it mean? How come it looks so weird and consistent? So the idea here is when you see a real GDP is less than the nominal GDP, which is the period after 2009, which means the current price level in the economy is higher than the base year level, which is consistent here because, well, after 2009, well, when inflation continued to rise price level, prices should be increasing. And in 2010 or 2012, the price level in those years should be higher comparing to the base year 2009, and therefore you see the nominal GDP is higher than the real GDP. However, before 2009, the real GDP is higher, consistently higher than the nominal GDP. What does it mean? That means, well, the current time price level, right, 2000 or 2001, 2003, is lower than the base year 2009. And as a result, well, the real GDP is greater than the nominal GDP. The red line is above the blue lines. So this interesting characteristics here, it's usually true when an economy has a consistent inflations across time periods, right? Except the fact that, well, if there is a strong deflations to drive price level downwards comparing to the previous years, then you might actually see the cross of that of the two lines in some years, right, in the past. But consistently in the UK, that there is a very, very steady growth of price level over time. Well, another reason why is it so important to study real GDP, or we don't want to misinterpreting some of the reports or news is because sometimes people who don't actually know the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP, they might actually have this very confusing or misinterpreting plots like this one here, where is actually plotting out the nominal GDP in Venezuela over time versus the real GDP. If you look at the nominal GDP has this very significant growth over time, you might think that, well, this economy is doing so well over time, it has this significant growth in that 13 years. However, if you really look into the real GDP lines, you don't see any growth, right? So what's the problem here? Why is it so different? Well, in Venezuela, again, there has been a very significant inflations happened in the past 20 years. So price level has been very fluctuated and inflated very fast. And as a result of the price level goes up so fast, the nominal GDP will also rise very fast. Because remember, the nominal GDP does not encounter price level changes over time. So when prices go up, the overall value of the goods and services will also go up. And as a result, the lines look so phenomenally great. But if we consider the real GDP, well, we actually know that people are not actually getting any better, right? Because the real GDP is speaking of the truth of how people are making their living based on the level of goods and services they can enjoy, right, when prices are fixed. And we don't see people actually getting any better. So therefore, interpreting the nominal GDP and real GDP correctly is the very important things to start thinking about the growth of an economy, right? So you don't want to measure growth with the nominal term, but only with the real terms. So high inflation is the cause of this nominal GDP rises in Venezuela. So Another important things to note is when we talk about the overall size of the economy, sometimes it's not very fair or not very accurate to talk about the well-being of the people in the economy, right? Because we can consider the situation where one country is very big that has a lot of people living in there, but has this same amount of GDP comparing to the other smaller economy that has a lot fewer people. So we cannot say the two economies are equal, or the people within the economies are equivalently living the same standard, right? Because you can consider the number of people taking the GDP in the big country will be a lot smaller. So therefore, one way to talk about the well-being of the population is to measure the per capita GDP or the growth of the per capita GDP, right? So consider here we have an example how we are measuring the per capita GDP. So is basically defined by the real GDP per populations, right? So we have the GDP of this economy, which is $100 million, and we have 50,000 people living in there. And as a result, we have a per capita GDP, which is 2,000 per capita. So on average, everyone in the economy has $2,000 of income. So that's a very this is basically a way how we can actually compare the well-being of the populations across different countries, right? Instead of using the general real GDP measurements across time, across different regions. Well, another important indicator of our economy is the real GDP growth rate, right? So instead of talking about per capita, we also want to know, well, whether one economy is growing faster than the other one. So here's another example of how we calculate the growth rates. So it's pretty much the simple percentage change calculations. So the idea here is to take the current real GDP minus the previous real GDP divided by the previous real GDP and multiply by 100% so that we can get the percentage growth of the real GDP year by year, right? Or maybe period by period. So in this case, the real GDP goes from $100,000 or $100 million to $110 million from 2018 to 2019. And as a result, the economy actually experiencing a 10% year-to-year growth of real GDP between the 2 years. Another important concept here to basically demonstrates the different measure of economic activities is what we call the gross national product, GNP. So you might actually heard of the term GNP, but most of the time you heard the term GDP, of course. So the measure of GDP and GNPs are fairly similar. And to be honest, most people actually confuse about them. But there is a very easy way to identify the difference between the two. So the GDP basically measure everything produced within the domestic border of the economy. However, GNP actually measure everything that produced by the residents of the domestic economy, even though it's produced outside of the border of the economy. However, in GNP, the gross national product, we don't measure anything that is produced domestically but owned by foreign companies. So let's take a quick look here so that we can get an idea. So, for example, Toyota is a Japanese-owned company, and if they are running the production in the United States, we are going to consider the Toyota production in the United States is included in the United States GDP, but not United States GNP, right? Because United States GNP only includes any firms and company that owns by the residents of the United States. But unfortunately, or maybe by the fact that Toyota is not owned by US citizens, so we cannot include them. On the other hand, If Apple is producing producing their phones or iPads or maybe the computer in China, so what should we count this into? So it should count into the measure of GNP, but not the US GDP. And the fact that, well, it's running the production outside of the border of the United States, it cannot be counted as GDP. But since Apple is owned by the United States citizens, so therefore, well, it counts toward the GNP. On the other example, Ford, it's a company owned by the US citizens. It's running the production in Mexico, and you can tell now it's going to be included in GNP, but not GDP. Volkswagen's production running in the US. Again, Volkswagen is a Germany-owned company, not the United States owned. As a result, we only count it towards the US GDP, but it cannot be counted towards GNP. Nike productions in Vietnam run into GNP of the United States, but no GDP in the United States. So you can see that there are some example here that can help you to differentiate the two. But most of the time, right, if you think about this, most of the time, GDP and GNP can be the same measure. Like for example, if we have McDonald's actually selling a meal in the United States, the meal is basically produced in the United States. And therefore, this meal sell in the market is count towards both the GDP and the GNP in the United States. The fact that while McDonald's is a US owned, and also the meal is produced domestically within the border, so therefore it can be counted towards to either one of the other. So the difference between GNP and GDP can be very easily defined, but it takes some time to realize the difference of the two and not to confuse them. And most of the time, they are very much in lines from one to another. GDP is more preferred, but GNP sometimes it's also alternative measurements of the overall economy of the domestic economy. Well, now that we have covered most of the topics in the measure of overall activities in the economy, now then we can talk about the overall price level in the economy. Right, we talk about several topics on like how expensive, high cost of living can be very bad, and we want to know how to measure them. And particularly, we want to also talk about how we can measure the changes of this price level over time. So we want to have one number to summarize all prices in the economy. So how are we supposed to do that? So the overall market values that speak of the overall productions in the economy that we call GDP, it's a great measurement. However, it's hard to think about one number that can summarize all prices across different sectors and different industries. So we came up with the concept called price index. So we want to use one index number to basically say, well, this is the index that represents a price level in a particular time period so that we can compare this index across time to say whether we have a 5% increase of prices or 2% increase of prices or 1% decrease in prices. So there are several index or indices can be used to measure the overall price level, and they measure different things. So the most popular one is called the Consumer Price Index, CPI. And then we have the Producer Price Index, the PPI, that measure the production factor price level. And also, ultimately, we have this GDP Deflator, which measure the overall price level in the economy. And we will talk a little bit more in details about each one of them and how they are different from each other. So first, let's talk about the Consumer Price Index. So the CPI is an index number that measures the dollar. They're not measuring in dollar or any other units. So the CPI is an intent to measure changes in the overall price level across time periods so that we can compare the changes of those prices. When we're calculating the CPI, we assume households buy the same market baskets of product each month so that we can track how this price level of the market baskets changes from time to time. And this assumption here is very important, right? This market baskets, how we set it up, how we are actually design these baskets can sometimes be very technical. But we are not going to jump into the detail, but we are just going to show you some example how this market baskets in theory actually works. The percentage change in this price index or CPI from one year to another is what we call inflations. The businesses also use CPI. So not only just households care about how much prices has gone up, but the businesses also want to know how these prices are changing over time so that they can set the product's price level correctly in the market and also consider the wage adjustments for the employees. Federal government also used this CPI measure to adjust the Social Security payments, right? So as a cost of living adjustments. Well, first, let's think about market baskets that we use in the United States in 2010. So if we look at the price chart here, or the pie chart right here, majority of the goods and services that we include in the market or theoretical market baskets here is housing, transportations, food and beverages. So those are the main category, how regular households spend the money, right? So it's very reasonable ratios how we set up these baskets based on this main category. Well, the rest of them are education, communication, recreations, medical care, motor fields, appeals. So those are the things that actually comes into a smaller categories in this baskets. So note that the market baskets that make up the indices actually differ from country to country. So we're only talking about the US market baskets in 2010 here. And if you consider maybe in Japan or French, they might set up their market baskets differently. Like for example, the weight that putting on different specific categories of items could be different across this country because in the United States, we might have a higher weight putting on consumptions of meats, right? Because we consume a lot of the meats, right? And also dairy products. Versus in Japan, they might actually putting a bigger weight on like fisheries or maybe rices. Comparing to the United States, where we're putting more on products like potatoes, right? So those are the foods that we usually consume every day, right? In French, on the other hand, they might actually have a higher weight on putting the market baskets on with wineries, right, or wine products, comparing to other country because they are one of the largest wine consumptions, right, country in the world. So therefore, you can see how this market baskets can be very dynamically different across different countries. Now, having said that, we have, let's suppose, a market basket in this very simple economy setup. So we have a country that only set up the market or theoretical market baskets with water, bread, and clothes. And we have this hypothetical quantity of each goods that we assume in a particular year, and we assume this quantity of goods will be consumed the same across different year as well. So we have 2000, 2005, and 2010 measures, and each of this category has a different price that we track in those years. To measure the CPI, we first has to measure the total expenditure values that we spend on this particular set of goods in the baskets based on the prices in each year. So as you can see, well, in 2000, we have this expenditure of $360 spent on this basket, versus in 2005, we have to spend $460 to get the same exact basket of goods. And in 2010, we spent $555. Now, we get this total number. To measure or to calculate the CPI, we are going to use the current expenditures that we spend on the baskets divided by the base year where the basket is cost. So for example, if we want to measure the CPI in the base year 2000, we're going to use $360, the total spending on the baskets, divided by the cost of the basket in the base year, which is exactly the same number, 360. So we get 360 divided by 360 equals to 1, and then we multiply by hundreds. Well, we get a normalized index value equals to 100. And that means, well, in this particular year, 2000s, we have no price difference to the base year. Now, if we are going to measure the CPI in 2005, the only thing we need to change in that calculation is to take the numerator in the divisions, except we are using the base year 2000s, we are using the current year, $460, divided by exactly the same denominator, the cost of the basket in the base year, 360, and then multiply by 100. In 2010, the same. We replace the numerator with 555 and divided by 360 and then times 100. So you can give yourself a little time to try calculating the CPI in 2005 and 2010, just as a practice. So after calculating that number, obviously, we cannot just use the CPI to tell us the absolute sense how high the price level is, but only how much it changed over time, right? So CPI equals to 100, as we mentioned before. That means, well, there is no price difference comparing to the base year, which is very obvious. When CPI is greater than 100, that means, well, the price level in the current year is higher comparing to the base year. And when CPI is less than 100, that means, well, the current price level is lower than the base year. So to measure the changes of this price level, we're going to apply the same exact percentage change equations to measure the changes of this index. So the simple way to do it is to use the number we calculate in the previous exercise, right, in 2 slices before, and apply it to these equations. So we want to measure the change of price level from 2005 to 2010, and we use the current CPI, which is the price level or the CPI in 2010, minus the CPI in 2005, and then divided by the CPI in 2005, and then we multiply by 100%, and we get the number here. It's approximately 20.3% increase in price level between the 2 periods. So most of the time, when we talk about CPI measures, most of the economists assume the CPI measures are overstating the actual inflation rates based on 4 different biases. So the first one is what we call the substitute bias, is when people buying the same amounts of goods we assume people are buying the same amounts of each product in the market baskets from the very beginning. However, this kind of baskets can be dynamically changing over time, right? So we're shifting consumptions of certain products to different things, right? Like phone services, or maybe cable TVs, or maybe the number of clothes to purchase every month, right? So those can be dynamically changed. And second of all, the quality biases, right? So we are purchasing the phone in the year of 2000, comparing to the phone that we purchased in 2022. The quality of the phones is different, but we might be paying the same price, right, for better things. So that is the kind of biases that can also be shifting or overstating the index. New product biases, right? Things that actually measure today comparing to 10 years ago, right? So there might be something that it's non-existent 10 years ago, but it's becoming very popular today, right? And the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually update these baskets every 10 years, but it might not be capturing the current new products developments, right, quick enough. Also, what we call outlet biases. This usually happens in the mid 90s, where the new big outlet mall actually happens to develop in the United States, where the discount products or the discount store has been offered to consumer as comparing to the regular price store across the country. So therefore, this CPI, again, it might not be the perfect measures of the overall price level. However, even though we are overstating the true inflations, but there are basically marginal differences to the actuals. Consider 0.5 to 1% as a margins. It's reasonable assumptions here. Well, on the other hand, we can also measure the price level of different things, right? So instead of the consumer goods or the final goods, we can also apply the same exact methods to measure the prices of the intermediate goods or the goods or factors in productions. So this example here basically demonstrates exactly the same measures where we have the market baskets of the intermediate goods, steel, woods, and neighbors to make productions in an economy, and then we measure the total expenditure on this baskets of goods with different prices across years. Then we can come up with the index figure that is called the producer price index. The final measure here that we would like to discuss is what we call the GDP deflator. So the GDP deflator is a little bit different in terms of the concepts, how we measure the baskets of goods, because the GDP deflator depends on the nominal GDP and real GDP. And the way how we're measuring it is to assume that every goods and services in the economy, instead of a set of baskets of goods, so everything that we measure or tracked in the economy will be included in this measurements. So when we're dividing the nominal GDP in a particular year by the real GDP in that same year, then we will get a ratio. And this ratio will be normalized to a value or index value to hundreds and multiplied by 100. And the interpretations of this GDP deflator will also always be the same. So in the base year, we always get the same number for nominal GDP and real GDP. So therefore, you will get an index of 100. But any year where you have the index higher than 100, that means, well, that year has a higher prices comparing to the base year. When you have a GDP deflator that has a index number lower than 100, that means, well, the overall price level is in the current period, it's lower than the base year. And we can also use this GDP deflator to calculate the overall price changes from period to period using the same exact percentage change equations. However, the measure of GDP deflator is a little bit more general, and it's not specific enough to say about the cost of living for the general households because it includes everything. So think about the extreme case where the price index here is also including like luxury goods, like fancy sports car, diamonds, right, gold exchange, right, or anything that we don't usually purchase every day. But the CPI, it's more specifically designed to the overall cost of living for the general households. So here's the measures of overall price levels that you can actually see how it changes over time between the CPI measure, the PPI, and the GDP deflator. And obviously, you can see that, well, they are almost always in lines, right? Even with the business cycle here, you can obviously tell they are always moving to the same directions. And in a particular year, like in 2030, you can see, well, deflation happened because there's a depressions, Great Depressions happens, and then World War II, you see the inflation, and then in 1990s, where we have the price stability over times, right? In that periods, because we have this very specific set of regulation implemented to stabilize prices. And in 2000 and 2010, there is a swing of energy and food prices where you see some fluctuations of the PPI there. But in general, right, you can totally tell how this price levels actually ties with the business cycle in the United States. So in this chapter, we have studied both the measure of the general economic activities using GDP and also the overall price level using CPI or maybe other price indices. So there are a lot to cover in this chapter, but the idea here is to understand why these measurements are important and how we are measuring them and what it represents, how we should interpret these measurements. So there will be some math involved. However, I hope that everyone here will have a chance to practice in your assignments and your activities in the class so that you can get more familiar with those measurements and understand better why those measurements are important in the study of macroeconomics. Well, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed this content, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.